Good morning. Good to see you guys all here this morning. Looking out, it looks like it'd be a good time to remind you that there are two other service times here. 8:15, there's plenty of space. 9:30, there's a little bit more space. Better donuts at both of those services, all right? So if you want to come earlier, you can do that. You'll have a little more space, and you'll have better donuts. It seems like it was quite a while ago that we wrapped up our More Than Able commitment project. And it feels a little bit like we've been waiting now a long time, waiting for things to get started. We're almost there. There's been a lot of work that's happening in the waiting. But starting next month, things are going to start moving. Beginning on first week of April, we're moving the church office out of the building to get ready for some room for construction. So the new office, by the way, will be at 1700 Lyons Road. You don't need to write that down. You'll get it in lots of emails between now and then. That's also the space that we'll be using for groups and classes that meet during the week. And it's the space that we'll be using for the 10 o'clock service on Easter Sunday. So if you'd like to try that out, different service, different place, different feel, you can sign up for that service on the Church Center app. And the reason we're asking you to sign up is because the space is limited, and so we want to make sure we have enough room for everybody, but also it's a way for us to kind of encourage you, hey, if you don't have kids and you're looking for a kind of a laid-back service and you want to make more room here for people who maybe haven't heard the gospel, a great way to do that is to go to the service there at 10 o'clock, and you can sign up to do that. We got a lot of other really exciting things happening with the More Than Able project. In just a couple of weeks, on April 6th, we'll be having our groundbreaking Sunday. We'll celebrate here Sunday morning, and then at 4 o'clock, you can come back for the ceremony. We'll have lots of fun things for families to do. It'll be a great time for us to kick off this new building project. Many of you know that in this service and in the other services, our church family committed over $3 million to make this project happen. And I am so grateful to you for making those commitments, and for the many of you who have already started giving towards those commitments. Up to right now, we've collected over $765,000 towards this project, and that's all you guys. So well done. Thank you for that. Having you be giving up front really helps us as we launch into this project, and I appreciate that. Some of you will remember that today was supposed to be our groundbreaking Sunday. And aren't you glad that that got delayed? Because it would have been a ground mushing ceremony instead of a groundbreaking. And so we are glad that it got delayed. Now, most of the time in life, we're not really excited about delays, are we? Most of the time in life, when something happens that delays us, it's easy for us to get frustrated. It's easy for us to get angry, to get stressed, to be anxious, because we don't know what's happening. Most of us don't like to wait. I know I don't. And sometimes when you find yourself waiting in life, it can become a struggle to know what to do with yourself. This is actually one of the themes in Joseph's life. We've been working our way through this guy Joseph's life, and last week Andrew talked to us, and when Andrew was finished, Joseph was in prison. And that's kind of the story of Joseph's life. He starts out, things are going well, and then it goes badly. And then it goes well, and then it goes badly. And it feels like every week we leave him in a bad spot, and this week won't be any different. We will leave him in a bad spot again because one of the themes in his life is waiting. Always wait. And some of the things he's waiting for are waiting to be free, right? Waiting to get out of prison, waiting for somebody to actually be nice to him. But the big thing that he's waiting for is to be reunited with his family. Remember when Joseph was young, he had these dreams. And the interpretation of the dreams was that there would be a day when all of his brothers, he had a bunch of them, all of his brothers and all of his family would actually bow down to him in a sign of respect and honor. And that hasn't come true in his life yet, but his brothers, remember, took him and sold him into slavery. And so now, for probably decades, Joseph has been living in Egypt as a slave first and now as a prisoner, and those dreams have never been fulfilled. But Joseph believes that those dreams were given to him by God. And so in his mind, he's thinking, if God promised me that this was going to happen, then it's going to happen. And so he is waiting for his dreams to be fulfilled. He's waiting for God to come through and fulfill his promise. I think there's a powerful principle for us that we can learn from Joseph, and it's this. When you find yourself in a place in life where you're waiting, don't waste your wait. Don't waste your wait. It's so easy for us when we're waiting, and we wait for a lot of things, right? I mean, sometimes it's little stuff, like I'm just waiting at the counter for them to make my sandwich. Why is this taking so long? And sometimes it's really big things. God, I am waiting for you to come through in this situation because if you don't, it's going to be a disaster. God, I am waiting for you to move me from here to somewhere else so I can flourish. God, I'm waiting for you to resolve this problem. God, I'm waiting for you to bring this person back, whatever it may be. Sometimes in life we're waiting on really big things, and it can be easy when we're waiting to waste that time because we're only looking at the then and we lose our focus on the now, but not Joseph. Joseph understands that while he is waiting, there is work to be done. And while he is waiting, he can trust God. And that changes the person that he is. We're going to see that this morning, all right? So if you have your Bible, open it to Genesis chapter 40. If you want to pull it up on your phone or your tablet, or if you just want to follow along on the screens, we'll put it up there. Genesis 40, verse 1. After this, the Egyptian king's cupbearer and baker offended their master. So the cupbearer is the guy who brings the Pharaoh all of his food. He's a very trusted guy. He's probably one of his counselors. And the baker is also a very trusted servant because he makes the food for the king. Understand, if you wanted to poison the king, you'd go through the baker or the cupbearer. And so these have to be very trustworthy people who have worked their way up. They're very important. They're very powerful in Egypt. And they've offended the king. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us why. I have an idea. This is just my guess. It's just speculation. So don't hold me to it. But I wonder if what's going on here is that there was some kind of a coup attempt, like an attempt to overthrow Pharaoh. I believe that Pharaoh is a very young man in this story. He's very young, that his father was probably killed in battle or somewhere else. So Pharaoh is very young. The country might be run by other counselors, and there was an attempt to overthrow. This is my speculation. And as a result, Pharaoh's really mad because he suspects that these two guys were a part of it. And so he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard assigned Joseph to them. Okay, pause. A little more speculation here. This speculation is more grounded, though. Do you remember last week when Andrew was preaching, and he said that he suspected that Potiphar actually believed Joseph? Remember, Potiphar's wife lies about Joseph, and as a result, Joseph gets thrown in prison. And Andrew said, I suspect that Potiphar actually believed Joseph because if he actually thought that Joseph did what he was accused of, he would have killed Joseph, and he didn't. He put him in prison, which leads us to believe. Let me build on that a little bit here, all right? When Joseph is first put into prison in chapter 39, we're told that he is under the control of the warden of the prison. But we meet a new character here in chapter 40. Notice that Pharaoh doesn't give the cupbearer and the baker over to the warden. He gives them to someone else. He gives them to the captain of the guard, one of his most trusted followers, a person who's very high up in Egypt, the captain of the guard, the head of the FBI or the Secret Service or whatever you may want to call it. He gives these guys to them and says, I want you to put them in prison. And the captain of the guard then does what? He takes them to prison and says, who do I trust in this prison? Joseph. Joseph, you're in charge of these guys. And if you go back to chapter 39, what you discover is that the captain of the guard is none other than Potiphar. And so it appears here that Potiphar actually still trusts Joseph. He still thinks that Joseph is a man of character and integrity. And what this shouts at us about is the kind of person that Joseph was. That even though in his life a lot of things have gone wrong, he is still a person who is full of character, who is full of integrity, who others look at and trust. And so the captain of the guard turns these guys over to Joseph. And they were in custody for some time. The Egyptian king's cupbearer and baker, who were confined in the prison, each had a dream. Both had a dream on the same night, and each dream had its own meaning. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught. Have you ever had a dream that left you distraught? Like you don't know what it means, or maybe it's so realistic, and you wake up and you're angry at everyone who was in the dream. And you're like, I can't believe you did that. And they're like, I don't know what I did. You're like, oh, you know what you did. Like, I have no idea. It was a dream. I wasn't there, right? But that's what's going on here. They had these dreams that were so realistic that it leaves them distraught and confused and not knowing what's going on. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today? Joseph reveals something about himself here that we need to see. Joseph reveals that he is what I would call a noticer. He notices something here. Do you see that there's words here that show us this? It says that Joseph saw that they were distraught, and he asked. You see, Joseph's focus is on other people. He's not focused on himself. He sees that these guys are distraught. How many times in your life do you think that you've walked right past someone who was distraught? How many times in your life have you been distraught and had someone walk past you? You see, we love it when people notice us, but too often we don't do a good job of noticing others, especially when we're in a time of waiting. Because when I'm in this time of waiting, my focus almost always goes to myself. My life is so bad right now. I am so nervous about what's going to happen next. I am miserable. I am angry. Me, I. Our focus is on ourselves. And hear this. This is the principle from the life of Joseph. If you don't want to waste your wait, you need to learn to focus on people instead of problems. It's so easy for us to pay attention to our problems that we don't notice the people around us. And what Joseph does is he notices. Listen, if anybody had a reason not to notice other people, it's Joseph, right? Joseph, who was his father's favored son, and lost that when he was thrown in the well. Joseph, who was one of many brothers and lost that when he was sold into slavery. Joseph, who had risen to the power in Potiphar's house, but lost that when he was falsely accused. And now Joseph, who is in prison waiting and not knowing if he will ever get out. If anybody had a reason to focus on themselves, it was Joseph. But Joseph doesn't focus on himself. He focuses on others. Let me take a second here and just pause and give you a commercial. Can I do that? Of course I can do that. I have the microphone. I don't know if you guys have noticed this about Joseph, but Joseph seems to be this guy who always rises to be influential. And even though he never has position and he never has power, he's always a great influencer. Have you seen this? Like in his father's house, he's the youngest. He's probably one of the smaller ones. And even though he doesn't have power or position, he rises to be a person of influence. His father trusts him more than he trusts any of the brothers. And when he's a slave in Potiphar's house, he's a lowly slave. He has no position, he has no power, but still he rises to a place of influence because he's trustworthy, because he's a person of integrity. And when he gets thrown in prison, he's just a prisoner there, but very quickly he rises to a place of influence, even though, again, he has no position and no power. And it's because of his character. And what we recognize in Joseph is that having power and having position doesn't always mean you have influence. You have probably known people who were leaders in your life, who had all the power and all the position, and they were terrible leaders and had no influence because they had no integrity. They had no character. And you've probably also known people in your life that have had no power and no position, but have had incredible influence because they had integrity and they had character. It is my belief that every single one of you has the ability to be an influential person. You can influence others towards the kingdom of God. And it is my opinion that every single one of you here has the ability to lead people towards Jesus, if you will lean on character and integrity instead of power and position. And I think this is important for our church. And so one of the things that we want to do to foster this, to grow this, is we're creating a new class that's going to launch this spring. Right after Easter, it's called Leadership 101. And this is designed to kind of talk through what it looks like to be a person of influence, not because of power and position, but because of character and integrity. Now, you'll be hearing more from me about this as it gets closer, but if you want more information, you can go on the Church Center app and learn a little bit about this and maybe sign up to be part of that first group that goes through it starting in April. But let's get back to Joseph, all right? So Joseph is in prison, and he notices, because he's paying attention, he's focusing on others, and he says, "What's going on, guys? Why the long faces?" Verse 8, "We had dreams," they said to him, "but there is no one to interpret them." And then Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Now, this is a significant statement from Joseph, because what Joseph is saying is, I believe in God. Now chew on that for a second. After everything that's happened to him, Joseph still believes. You know, we live in a time when so many people walk away from their faith because they don't like the way their life is going. Right? I didn't get something I wanted. Or life took a twist I didn't expect. There was this diagnosis. There was this dysfunction, whatever it may be. And so I'm going to deconstruct my faith. I'm going to walk away from the faith. I'm not going to believe in God anymore because life isn't what I want it to be. And again, if anybody could be justified in doing this, it's Joseph. Right? Joseph had everything, now he's got nothing. And then he had everything again, and then he had nothing again, and then he had everything again, and now he's got nothing again. This is the story of Joseph's life, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and there is no way that Joseph can possibly see how God can come through, how God can fulfill his promises, how God can fulfill his dreams. And yet he still believes. What a powerful testimony to what true faith looks like. So Joseph says, God can interpret your dreams. So tell me your dreams. And so they begin. The cupbearer goes first. He says, well, I had this dream. There were these three vines that all produced grapes. And I plucked the grapes off of them, and I squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup. And then I brought Pharaoh's cup full of wine to him, and he drank it. And it was like I was back to normal. Like back how I was before prison. And Joseph said, well, the interpretation of your dream is simple. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, and you will return to service. You'll be back in his service, and things will be exactly as they were before. That's pretty good news. Just 3 days. And the baker hears this, and he says, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Whew. He says, let me tell you my dream. I was walking along, and I had 3 baskets on my head, and they were full of baked goods, because he's a baker. And in the top basket were all kinds of different baked goods that I was bringing to Pharaoh so he could eat. And as I walked, the birds came and ate the baked goods out of the top basket. Joseph, what does this mean? And Joseph, I imagine as gently as he could, said, in 3 days, Pharaoh will also lift up your head, and then he'll take it off. You're going to be executed. And this is what he says, the birds will come and eat your flesh. Now, again, we're back to speculation. I don't know if what happened is they did an investigation and found out the cupbearer wasn't part of the plot and the baker was. I don't know. But whatever happened is 3 days later, Pharaoh's guards came and they took the cupbearer and brought him back to the palace, and he began to serve Pharaoh again. And they took the baker and they executed him, just as Joseph said they would. But I want you to see something that Joseph says in verse 14, because it's helpful for us to understand how deep Joseph's faith is. Joseph says, but when all goes well for you. So see, look, this is the interpretation of your dream, and I believe 100% without doubt that God will do what he says he will do. So when God does this, when God does what he says he's going to do, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. Joseph is like, look, 3 days, you're going to get out, you're going to see Pharaoh, tell him my story. Now, this doesn't seem to be a big ask, does it? And I would love to tell you that this is the moment when the story changes. Like, this is the big turning point. Finally, everything's been downhill for Joseph, and now it starts going uphill. Things are going to get better from here on out. It's going to be amazing. You're not going to believe how good things get from here. I wish I could tell you that, and I can't. Because what happens next is what keeps happening over and over again to Joseph. He's forgotten. Look at verse 23. It says, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And our immediate response to this is, what a jerk. Right? What an idiot. I mean, we could go on down the list of this guy's dumb. It was 3 days and he couldn't remember. But what I want us to focus on is not what the cupbearer did, but what God is doing. Because when the cupbearer forgets Joseph, God is not up in heaven saying, what? I set this up perfectly. This guy blew it. What am I going to do now? That's not what God was doing. You see, when the cupbearer forgot Joseph, God was up there saying, yep, that's the plan. But I imagine that wasn't what Joseph was thinking. I mean, just think about what Joseph went through. 3 days. 3 more days, I'm going to get out of here. Because in Joseph's mind, the cupbearer is going to get out. He's going to go directly to Pharaoh, and he's going to say, Pharaoh, I met this guy in prison. He's a great guy, took good care of me. You got to get him out. He's innocent. Let him out. And Pharaoh's guards would come. They'd release Joseph, and Joseph could finally go home to his family. And Joseph is probably playing this scenario out. He's like, I'm going to go home, and they're all going to be excited to see me because I've been gone for so long. And maybe that's where my dreams are going to be fulfilled, and they're all going to bow down because they're so happy to see me. This is going to be amazing. 3 days. And he's starting to pack his cell, right? Got to get my stuff ready to go because in 3 days, I'm going home. And that third day comes, and he waves goodbye to the cupbearer, right? Have fun at the palace. Can't wait to get out. And the third day comes and goes, and Joseph hears nothing. And he's, I'm sure just bureaucratic red tape, right? They need to get that cleaned up, but I'm sure they'll come today. And the fourth day comes and goes, and the fifth day, and the first week, and the first month, and 6 months. And at some point, Joseph says, he forgot. He forgot. And I know that for many of you, this is what you're feeling. Not that the cupbearer forgot you, but that God did. Because sometimes it feels like God has forgotten us. We've been waiting so long, and the waiting has been so difficult. So let me just give you 3 things to think about when you feel like God's forgotten you. The first one is this. God always finishes what he starts. We're going to see that. We're going to see that in Joseph's life. That God always finishes what he starts. Paul said this in Philippians 1. You guys hear me say this verse a lot because I think it's helpful for us. That he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. You remember that Paul wrote that from prison? But even in prison, thinking he was on death row, Paul's confident enough in God to write that he who began a good work will be faithful to complete it. And if God has started something good in you, he is going to finish it, not necessarily in your time, not necessarily the way you would choose, but in his time and the way he chooses, which is way better than anything you could choose. God always finishes what he starts. The second thing to think about when you find yourself waiting is that you can only be faithful where you are. And if you are faithful there, it will lead you to where you need to be. See, so often for me, I'm an impatient person. So I'm the kind of impatient person that we'll be at the grocery store with my family, and we get to the front, and we see like there's lines at all the cash registers. I'll say to my kids, all right, everybody go to a different line. I'm going to stand here with the cart. We'll see which one is moving faster, and then I'll bring the cart over there and cut in front of you. I'm that kind of impatient person. Like, every part of my life is scheduled out to the annoyance of my entire family. And like, I have to be 20 minutes early for everything because that's how I live. And so when I talk about waiting, I'm preaching more to me than any of you. Because if I'm that way about grocery lines, can you imagine what I am when I'm waiting on God to do something big in my life? Like, God, why aren't you moving here? Why aren't you changing this? Why aren't you fixing this? God, I thought that by now I'd be here. And because I live my life by a schedule, I've got a schedule for God too. And I start saying things like this: God, if you would just take me from here to here, I would be so faithful to you here. Right? You ever prayed that? God, if you will just do this for me, then I will be so faithful to you. God, if you will just fix this for me, then I will be so faithful to you. But here's the reality. You can only be faithful where you are. And if you're faithful there, God will move you to where you need to be. This is the story of Joseph's life. I don't think he ever picked any of the places he ended up. But wherever he was faithful. And so in your time of waiting, be faithful where you are. Here's the third thing to remember. A delay is not a denial. A delay is not a denial. Don't you think at some point, maybe it was 6 months in, maybe it was a year in, that Joseph started to think that his dreams had been denied? I don't even know how long Joseph had been in prison, but he waited 2 years after the cupbearer left without ever hearing anything. And at some point, I believe that Joseph had to be thinking to himself, why has God denied me? Why do I still have to wait? But a delay is not a denial. Joseph's dreams were on delay, but God still had a plan. We see that plan begin to work out in the next chapter. It tells us that 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. It was a weird dream. So he sees these 7 cows, and they're these big, juicy cows, the kind of cows that Burger King uses in their burgers. And these big, juicy, delicious cows are on the bank of the Nile eating and drinking the water. And then he sees into his dream come these 7 awful, dirty, nasty cows. They're thin, they're gaunt, they're emaciated. They're the kind of cows that McDonald's uses in its burgers. And then in his dream, the McDonald's cows eat the Burger King cows. And you can just imagine how vivid that must have been and how awful it must have been. And so Pharaoh wakes up, and he's like, oh, I've got to eat more chicken. And he kind of shakes off the dream, and then he goes back to sleep. And he has another dream, and in this dream there are 7 heads of wheat that are big and full and abundant. And then there's 7 heads of wheat that are dying. They've got no water, and it looks like they're about to die. But then the 7 dying heads of wheat eat the 7 healthy heads of wheat. And again, he wakes up and says, what is going on? These dreams, they're awful. And he begins to ask all of his counselors and his wise men, what's going on with these dreams? And eventually, part of the conversation is this guy who brings him his food and his drinks that we know as the cupbearer. And the cupbearer says, wait, you're having dreams? I know a guy. Like in that moment, he remembers. Now, here on earth, we just look at it and say, whew, finally, it's about time. I can't believe he finally remembered. What a good coincidence for Joseph that Pharaoh had a dream and this guy remembered. But up in heaven, God was like, see, I told you. He didn't remember back then because I wanted him to remember right now. And so Pharaoh says, well, get this guy, bring him to me. And they bring Joseph to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, I'm having these dreams. And Joseph says, well, I can't interpret them, but God can. Joseph still believes. He says, Pharaoh, let me tell you what your dreams mean. They mean that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, abundance. Everything's going to grow. You'll have more than enough. but then those 7 years of plenty are going to be followed by 7 years of famine. There will be nothing. And so Pharaoh gives a bit of, or Joseph gives a bit of advice to Pharaoh, and he says, what you ought to do is during these 7 years of plenty, collect as much as you can, save as much as you can, so that when the 7 years of famine come, you'll have enough, and we won't starve. And Pharaoh says, that sounds like a good idea. Joseph, you're in charge. And just like that, Joseph has gone from prisoner to second in command in Egypt. And this was God's plan all along. This was God's plan to get Joseph to hear all along. And everything that Joseph said was going to happen happens. And we skip ahead to chapter 41, verse 56. It says, because the famine had spread across the whole country. So now we're past the 7 years of plenty and into the 7 years of famine. Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what comes next, because it's really important. Every nation came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe in every land. This is just a little bit of foreshadowing of what's about to come. Because do you know who's included in every land and every nation? Joseph's family. Joseph's brothers. They're on the way. And they're going to meet Joseph again, and they're going to see Joseph again. And get this, they're going to beg Joseph for food. They're not going to know it's him, but they're going to bow down to him, just like Joseph's dreams. But I want you to see the time here. Because how many years of plenty were there? Yeah, you guys are good at math. And how long after the cupbearer was Joseph in prison? And we don't know how long he was in prison after Potiphar's wife lied about him. But what we're saying here is from the time Joseph went into prison until he actually meets his brothers was at least a decade. 10 years of waiting. But while Joseph was waiting, God was working. And you got to see this. If Joseph hadn't waited, what would the result have been? Like what if when Joseph got thrown in the well at the very beginning of the story, and he cried out to God, said, God, save me, rescue me. And God looked down on Joseph and he said, well, Joseph, I had this big plan. Really intricate, a lot of moving parts. But since you're asking for help, I'll help you. Brothers change their mind, pull Joseph out of the pit. They all go back home and live happily ever after, right? Until the famine, and they all die. Because Joseph wasn't in Egypt to tell Pharaoh to store up the grain to save all of the nations of the world. Or what if when Joseph was in prison, and he cried out to God and said, God, I don't belong here. I'm innocent. And God sends the cupbearer, and he says to the cupbearer, hey, please remember me. And the cupbearer gets out and he immediately goes to Pharaoh. He says, Pharaoh, I got to tell you about this guy Joseph. He took good care of me in prison. He's innocent. He doesn't deserve to be in prison. And Pharaoh says, well, get him out. And they get him out. And they say, hey, head on back home. And he goes back home, and he sees his family, and they all live happily ever after, right? Until the famine comes, and they all die because Joseph's not in Egypt. Do you see this? That while Joseph is waiting, God is working, and he is working in ways that Joseph never could have imagined. But it's even bigger than this. It's not just about the fact that Joseph saved his brothers and his family and all of Egypt and the surrounding nations. God's doing something even bigger here. Because one of Joseph's brothers is this guy named Judah. Keep your eyes on Judah. He's not such a good dude, but God's going to do some good things through him. Because one of his descendants, hundreds of years later, is a guy named David, King David. And God's going to make a promise to David like he made to Abraham. He's going to say, look, my promised one is going to come. The one that I promised to Eve when I said that one day one of your descendants will crush the head of the serpent. That one, he's going to be one of your sons, David, and he's going to reign forever. And we're talking about Jesus. And 100 years after David, who comes onto the scene? But Jesus. But do you understand that Jesus is a descendant of David, who is a descendant of Judah? And if Judah dies in the famine, then what? God had this amazing plan. And this is the theme of the whole Old Testament, is that God's plan is never derailed and his timing is perfect. My timing is not perfect. I often think I need something now, and God's like, you don't need that now. You don't need that ever. But I know what you need, and I'm going to make sure you have it. And in your time of waiting, it's good to remember that God's plan is not derailed, and God's timing is perfect. And while you may not be able to see the end of the story, you can be faithful now. While you may not know what's coming next, you can focus on doing what God has for you now. Do you remember Joseph's focus? Joseph's focus, while he waited, was on people instead of problems. So if you're here today and you're waiting, and this is probably all of us, let me give you 3 really practical ways that you can wait well, that you can avoid wasting your wait. The first is similar to Joseph. Stay faithful where you are. For Joseph, faithfulness meant focusing on people instead of problems. And the same can be true for you. If you find yourself waiting right now is a great time to ask yourself a simple question: God, who can I serve right now? You want to get your eyes off your problem? Put your eyes on other people. Do you want to stop thinking about your problems? Start noticing other people's problems. And ask yourself, how can I serve others? This was actually the story of Joseph's life. Even when he was a young man, his father came to him and said, Joseph, I want you to go to your brothers. Joseph could have said, they hate me. Why would I do that? I'm really comfortable here at home. But Joseph says, Dad, if you want me to go, I'll go. Here I am. I'll go serve others. When he finds himself as a slave in Potiphar's house, the reason he gets elevated to head of the household is because he serves so well. When he finds himself in prison, the reason Potiphar puts these 2 guys into Joseph's cell is because Joseph serves so well. You see, if Joseph had been on his own, choosing not to look at others, focus on everything that was wrong in his life, he wouldn't have noticed the cupbearer. He wouldn't have seen that his face was downcast. He wouldn't have asked him about his dreams. He wouldn't have gotten out. He wouldn't have gone to Pharaoh. And the whole story changes. But when I'm willing to not waste my wait, when I'm willing to step into it, to lean into it, to say, God, who can I serve right now? Now I'm taking advantage of the place that God has me right now. Now I'm being faithful where I am. The second thing you can do to not waste your wait is to use this time to grow. One of the things that I love about Joseph is that he's always growing. As you go through his story, the obstacles that he has to meet get bigger and bigger and bigger. And he's able to meet every single one of them with character and with integrity because Joseph is growing throughout. He keeps his eyes on God. He doesn't lose his faith in God. And when I find myself in a time of waiting, one of the questions I can ask is, how can I grow right now? Like, what are some habits that I should be developing that will help me grow? What are some things in my life that I should be changing that will help me grow? What are some things in life that I should be letting go of that will help me grow so that I don't waste my wait, so that while I wait, I grow? And the third thing that you can do to not waste your wait is to trust God's timing, not yours. When I rely on my own timing and my own ability, that only leads me to a place of anger and frustration and stress and anxiety. But when I sit back and remind myself, God has a plan. His plan is never derailed. His timing is perfect. Now I can simply lean back and say to him, God, what are you trying to teach me right now? You see, that's not the question I normally ask. I'm an impatient person. The question I normally ask is, God, when are you going to fix this? God, why haven't you done what I've asked you to do? God, why won't you do this? But the question I need to be asking is, God, what are you trying to teach me right now? What do I need to learn in this? Because whether I like this or not, whether I want to be here or not, God, you have me here now for a purpose. So what can I learn? What are you trying to teach me? Joseph's story is so powerful because we all feel it. We all understand what Joseph is going through because we've been there and we are there. But don't just feel Joseph's story. Don't just say to yourself, yes, I know what's going on here. I've been here. I'm right with Joseph. Follow the example of Joseph. Live out the principles that we see from Joseph's life. Remind yourself that God has a plan. It's never derailed. His timing is perfect. And choose to not waste your wait.